Welcome back to the Cruise Elite podcast. I am here with a jet-lagged Tony, and he's actually a little bit sick. But what's up, Tony?
Story of my life, you know? I feel like that's the podcast intro. It's like, is Tony sick today or not?
Yeah. But tell us the good stuff, man. How was your trip?
So, I have friends stationed out in Amman, Jordan, in the Middle East, and they've been abroad for the past almost 4 years. And they're dear friends of mine, and they have a kid who's 3 years old that I haven't met yet. And so we've been talking about visiting them, and nothing ever lined up. But this year we were like, we're going to make it happen. And so come hell or high water, we were going to visit them. And we went down to see them. And man, it was such an amazing trip. To be with dear friends that I hadn't seen in a long time. Like, I hadn't seen his wife in like four plus years. Like,
Nice.
He's been back to the States a few times, but hadn't met his kid. It was awesome to stay with them. But also the country of Jordan is, for me at least, just because I wasn't too well versed on the history and the culture of the country, was really surprisingly beautiful. The food was excellent. I didn't have a bad meal.
Oh, I bet.
You know, they have like Dune, you know, the movie Dune was filmed there. And so they have these like huge deserts in the south of the country and ruins built into the rocks in Petra. And we stayed at like a Bedouin, like kind of glam camp in like this red sand desert. It looks like Mars. And it was just, it was just unbelievable. Got in the Dead Sea.
Really?
Which, I don't know if you've ever been or if you ever...
No, I've done nothing like what you're talking about. I'm trying to picture it, but it sounds so cool.
Yeah, Indiana Jones comes to mind, like, you know,
right.
Like but yeah, the Dead Sea, I knew, you know, the thing that everyone tells you about the Dead Sea is it's really salty and you float.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew this going in, but you get in the water and you do not have to tread. You do not have to do anything. You can stand straight, like upright, like not even floating on your back, and you just float.
You float like a cork.
Yeah. Like the hard part is actually not letting your legs swing up because they want to get to the top.
Wow.
It's really surreal. Yeah. It's like it almost felt like being in space or something. It was just like really different.
Like as if you were in regular water that you might be in, and you had like flotation on, like that kind of feeling?
It felt like I had completely evenly distributed flotation. And like, you know, when you wear a weight vest, it's like, yeah, you're heavier, but it's all in like up here in your chest and shoulders, and like it doesn't feel normal. This is like it's completely perfectly distributed, right? So
wow. You know what that sounds like? That sounds like a perfect recipe for the Burdenko method exercises.
I was thinking that.
Yeah, I mean that, because when you're doing that stuff in the deep water, you want to have the flotation on because you don't want to be struggling to stay afloat. You want like total relaxation as you move. Man, that sounds like a perfect medium for that.
You guys got to make the trip, man. You guys got to make the trip and see for yourselves. And then, you know, I don't actually know anything about this, but like, isn't there something about salt water and like the minerals in salt water that's supposed to be good for you, like even in the ocean?
Apparently. And I mean, I got to say, when we go to the beach and stuff and hang out for any extended amount of time, I always feel better. I always feel better on the beach. So
I always wondered if it was the sun, but
could be that too. It's probably a combination of things, you know, all the right things at the right time at once. That sounds awesome.
Definitely put on a couple pounds of delicious.
It's okay.
You know, kebab and Lebanon and hummus and.
Yeah, I bet. Oh man, the hummus. I would be destroying the hummus.
Yeah. Oh man, so good. How have you been, man? I feel like it's been a minute.
It has been a minute, man. I feel like a lot of stuff has happened too. So let's see. We've been pounded with snow. So we've got like 3 feet of snow here. It's all compressed now and has like an icy top crust to it. But man, we've had a lot of snow to shovel over the last, especially last week, because we had back-to-back storms. So I was getting my workouts in, shoveling snow. You know what? During that time, before all of that, this was actually just before you left for your trip, I had some dental work done. And oh man, was it brutal.
Oh no.
So just like, I don't want to belabor it too much, but long story short, and it actually somewhat ties into what we're going to talk about today. I've been waiting patiently to get 2 very old mercury fillings removed from my mouth. Old, like, I mean, they've been in there for most of my life. I think I probably got those when I was like 10 years old, something like that. And they're falling apart, right? Which is not good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been waiting patiently. Anyone who's ever done, got significant dental work done, it's wildly expensive. So finally at a place to deal with all that. And I had the first filling removed on the left side. And, I've been grinding on those things for years and years and years, and the tooth is now super compromised. So they actually had to save what they could after removing the filling and then give me a crown.
Mm.
And so I've got like a temporary crown right now. So I went through this whole process, and what happened was when they put the temporary crown on the molar and they polish it to try to get it as close to size as your original tooth as possible, but they can't be perfect, and they know that. And so your bite is a little bit off when you get like a temporary crown.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like a big jaw clencher. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
everything I do, whether it's just, daily chores or, working out, jujitsu, whatever the case might be, like, my jaw is involved in that. And so the tooth wasn't perfectly sized, which means my bite wasn't perfect.
Mm-hmm.
When your bite's not perfect, that actually is a problem. So basically only like 24 hours of using my jaw the way you would, whether it's, chewing, talking, exercising, whatever. And I essentially, from biting, sprained all of it's basically a sprain, all of the ligaments for each tooth on the left side of my mouth. Now, I've had lots of different sprains in my athletic career.
Yeah.
This ligament, that ligament, whatever. I know what an acute injury feels like. Dude, this was another galaxy of pain.
Yeah.
Another galaxy, because once it's in your mouth and it's close to your brain,
All
it's
those
even
nerve bundles, all those nerve endings.
It's even higher threat. So it's taken several weeks to get to a place where now I'm over the worst and starting to recover pretty fast. But man, brutal, absolutely brutal. And guess what? I'm not done. I got to get the permanent one put on, and then eventually, at some point in the spring, I'm going to deal with the right side.
Oh man, I'm so sorry you're dealing with that.
But I'm happy to have the mercury out of my mouth.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
poisonous metal. Let's
exactly.
Put it.
Let's
into
get
your
it. Let's
body.
get that out of there. It's weird. It's pretty cool, actually. I thought that because my bite is so messed up right now, because what they did is I had to go back to the dentist, and they basically polished the temporary crown
Mm-hmm.
down enough so that they
Mm-hmm.
took it out of functional play, so that now when I bite, there's no contact.
Okay.
Now I hate that feeling because
Mm-hmm.
you can feel proprioceptively how that disturbs you. When you can't find your molars, you would never think this, but when you can't find your molars, it's like a mechanical advantage has been taken away from you. Like there's like just something, I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking about it now. Maybe it could be the equivalent of like putting on a new shoe, and that shoe doesn't allow your foot to do what you're used to and what you want it to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so you feel compromised in some way, whether it's like balance or stability. Kind of like that. Your teeth have to have a perfect home, in terms of your bite, and your jaw plays such a big role in your overall posture and stability. It's a weird feeling. I don't like it, but I will say last week I was working out and I expected to have a loss in strength, and I was doing some overhead pressing with a kettlebell, and I was crushing them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, man, this is so interesting, because I thought not being able to find my back left molar was going to make me weaker.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, I actually think that having that mercury gone has already contributed to better stability.
Interesting.
As bizarre as that seems. But that's not unusual, because like anything that's in contact with your body can have an effect, right? Positive or negative. So it's something to think about, and I'm sort of paying attention to that as I go through this whole process.
Yeah. I have so many questions. I don't know how long we want to spend on teeth, but
Yeah, I know.
Podcasts on teeth. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it is the dental system. It does matter, and gosh, in our courses, in our advanced course, the Neuro Dojo, we actually teach cranial mobility. And it's super powerful. It's an amazing tool. And one of the things that you actually can do with cranial mobility drills is involve pressure on the teeth in certain ways, whether you're using your tongue or, maybe something else to apply some input there. But yeah, your teeth matter, your jaw matters. They're very, very important part of the body.
Yeah. And what you said about threat being so close to the brain, being nerve endings, but also it's where you take in your nutrition, right? It's where you take in energy. So I feel like that's just a whole other reason the brain's probably super primed in. Like, you got to be able to chew that food,
Dude,
like
great point. It's from a survival perspective, your mouth is up there, right? It's if you look up, like, we've talked about it in the past, but the sensory and the motor homunculus, those images, that little depiction of the little dude, and he's got huge hands and a huge head and a huge face and big mouth and lips and stuff. It's that image helps you understand, like, the high priority areas of high priority in terms of how your brain feels about your body. But it's a good point.
Yeah. Well, good luck with the permanent fix and the next tooth. I'm sure we'll revisit this.
Permanent fix is coming up in a couple weeks anyway, and then so I'll be very glad to get this all behind me. So
yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Eat nothing but hummus for a while. You'll be fine.
So let's see, what are we hitting up today?
Yeah, so we've talked so much about the different sensory systems, the neural hierarchy. We talked so much about just how those inputs can be evaluated and assessed,
right,
and utilized to help with injury and pain and mobility and all of that good stuff, right? But one of the things that I've noticed that's a big part of your social media presence and your practice that I don't think we've actually dedicated an episode to yet are some of the drills that you do, the neuromechanic drills like nerve glides and that type of thing, where it really does seem like some of the high payoff and more immediate payoff stuff that you can do. And I'm really curious about diving a little deeper into that aspect of your practice, maybe going over some specific drills and talking about why you use them, how you use them, why they work, and when they work.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. I've been wanting to talk about this, and I'm glad that you decided to bring all of this up. So that's right. So the neuromechanic drills, that is the category of the exercises that we're going to be talking about, they're a category of drill that is focused on mobilizing nerves. And as you've seen over the last couple of years in particular, I share a lot of that stuff on Instagram. And generally, most of the time, I'm sharing exercises that we call nerve glides. I'll go over all the names here in a few minutes because there's a lot to it. You can do a lot of things with nerves. But we've shared a lot of that content, just teaching people basic nerve glides, and it is super popular. It's actually a really good fit for a platform like Instagram because nerve glides or neuromechanic drills in general, they happen to produce some really profound results, and they can work very quickly, whether or not you're trying to improve somebody's strength, stability, or decrease pain. So it's actually a really great fit for short form content. And I think that in the last 3 years, a lot of our growth on Instagram in particular has been because people really love learning the neuromechanic drills.
Mm-hmm.
And I get comments and DMs all the time about people who, saw one of my, in quotes, stretches, which they're not stretches. I'll explain that too. I've seen one of your stretches and I tried it, and I cannot tell you how many times people have said, I've spent thousands of dollars on physiotherapy. I've tried this, I've tried that. I never had any relief. I did one of your nerve glides and all my pain is gone. And that's the power of neuromechanic drills. That's why I like sharing them, because they really, when they produce results, it can be really wild.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about all the specifics, just like anything else. There's a time and place for them. There's a lot that goes into it. They're not stretches. It's more than that. And just like any other drill, they can be exactly what you need, or in some cases, they can actually be threatening. Mm-hmm. And you have to either change the way that you're doing them, right? There's lots of tweaks that you can make to the drill itself, or in fact, it might not be the right drill for you. So we can cover all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to start, one question I have is, we are mobilizing nerves.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's the terminology you used.
Yep.
A, how are we doing that? And B, how does that fit into kind of the neural hierarchy framework that we've discussed? Like with vision drills, for example,
right,
it's pretty obvious. Like you're using your eyes and doing specific things with your eyes. So where does this fit in that kind of framework?
That's a great question. So first, what I'll start with is mobilizing a nerve means that we're going to use some kind of technique to move it. Okay, so nerve glides or neuromechanic drills in general are a mobility technique. So most people at this point, probably most people listening to the podcast, already understand that taking your muscles and your joints through their fullest range of motion is a healthy thing to do. So that's one of the benefits of strength training, using full ranges of motion, or joint mobility drills like we often talk about, where the goal is to use a full range of motion. We know these things are healthy. We know that we need to move our joints and our muscles through a full range of motion, because what we don't use, we lose. If we don't keep accessing that range of motion, eventually our brain might go, hey, I don't know if I want to dedicate the energy to preserving this tissue. And so let's put less energy there. And over time, our movement box may shrink, right? And then in an extreme case, we might actually lose movement within joints. And then that can lead to a lot of different problems. And I'm speaking long term. So just like it's a healthy thing to bring your muscles and your joints through a full range of motion, it is equally as healthy to bring your nerves through a full range of motion. Okay, so when we do neuromechanic drills, that's essentially what we're doing. We're trying to either take the nerve and move it to its longest position, or maybe we're even trying to move it into its shortest position. But the point is, nerves have to be able to move, right? They have to be able to move just like our joints and our muscles, and they are a highway for neural information. So we have to make sure that they get adequate blood supply. We have to make sure that they're healthy and that they're mobile. And so we have several different techniques that fall into this category of neuromechanics that allow us to do that. And there's different reasons why you might need to call on neuromechanics for dealing with certain injuries, fitting them into your rehab for specific reasons. We'll get into all that. Actually, one of the cool things is that one of the largest misconceptions in the clinical world with nerves is that you have to have some kind of nerve problem for neuromechanics to be a useful tool. And that's actually not true. There's a lot of ways that you can look through the neuro lens and use nerve glides for lots of different reasons. Now, the other part of your question about where does it fall into the neural hierarchy. So at the most basic level, when we're thinking about the hierarchy, vision, vestibular, proprioception.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to call this an advanced proprioceptive tool.
Mm-hmm.
It's an advanced, right? We're not just working with a joint. We're not just working with a muscle. We're working with the nerve, and nerves supply muscles. Nerves can supply the skin, right? So it's an advanced proprioceptive tool. We've got peripheral nerves that we might choose to move in some way, and these nerves sometimes only supply a muscle, right? They sometimes only supply a portion of the skin. So we would call a nerve that supplies only a muscle. We'd call it a motor only nerve. So meaning like its responsibility is to supply a muscle only. We have other nerves that are sensory only nerves, meaning that nerve is only supposed to supply a certain portion of the skin. And then we have nerves that are both sensory and motor. So they supply muscles, a group of muscles, and a portion of the skin. And a lot of the nerve glides that you see me teaching on Instagram and stuff are both sensory and motor nerves. So it's an interesting category. A lot of people don't think about mobility training as involving moving your nerves.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of it for me, at least. When I think about nerves, it's kind of this amorphous system that's embedded in throughout the entire body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like we know there are nerve highways, like the vagus nerve or something like that, where it feels like it takes more shape in my mind. But I think, and I wonder if this is the common conception, but it kind of just feels like it's all in there somewhere. So the idea of like finding a specific nerve and moving it,
right,
is interesting to me in that way, because it's not usually how I think about nerves.
Yes, and you made me think about this. Technically, we don't have all these different peripheral nerves. If you look at diagrams of what we call the nervous system, and you see all the nerves originating in the spinal cord and then kind of moving out towards the periphery. Technically, as you start to learn how to use this style of drills, you need to start thinking differently, and you need to start thinking that we are one big nerve. We're one giant nerve that sort of branches out in a lot of different ways. And I can kind of visualize like maybe a spider web or something. And it's all one web. And maybe if you move part of the web, you're going to see that influences tension on the spider web, on the whole structure somewhere else that might be far away. And when you think about it that way, you can kind of start to understand how putting tension on a nerve somewhere in the periphery actually can affect other areas of the body way upstream of where you're actually applying the stimulus, because all of these peripheral nerves that we mobilize originate in the spinal cord and are pretty continuous with the contents of the spinal cord and its connective tissue, which eventually ends up at the brain or the sacrum, right? You can either go up or down with it, and it's all very connected. So there is a whole grouping of neuromechanic drills that we call spinal flossing drills. We'll talk about that when I start describing some of these different techniques, but that is actually when we decide to move a portion of the spinal cord when the nerve is under tension, and involving the mobilization of the spinal cord contents and what's called dura matter can be a really important thing when you're creating some advanced nerve glide type exercises.
Yeah, interesting. And another thing that you've talked about is like where certain things attach in the brain. Is that a factor that you think about in these types of drills as well? Like if you want to tap into a higher order
That's
system?
A great question. That's a very advanced question. So that's like stuff, that's like what we eventually talk more about in the Neuro Dojo, because so a nerve may have, let's just, for example, we'll just say maybe our goal is to mobilize a sensory and motor nerve. So that means it's going to supply a muscle and a portion of the skin. So we can look at the actual, well, I should first back up and say, when you are assessing a person's nerve, you actually have to take them through a little battery of sensory assessments to make sure that they're feeling sensations accurately at the skin level. You might also take them through several motor assessments to see how the muscle that the nerve supplies is functioning. So let's just say we are testing the tibial nerve, which is a branch of the sciatic nerve in the lower body. A lot of people know what the sciatic nerve is because at one point in their life they had some sort of sciatic symptom. Yeah. So the tibial nerve is a branch of the sciatic nerve, and it is both a motor and sensory nerve, and it's going to supply several different muscles on the back of the leg. There's like some medial hamstring involved in there, and then like the gastroc muscle, right? Your calf muscles. So if we want to test the health of the nerve, we might do some motor tests for, let's say, for example, the calf muscles. So you might have somebody do a bilateral calf raise and look at how their calf muscles are functioning. Do you see the development that you'd expect? Do you see the tone that you'd expect? And somebody who's had sciatica for a long time often will have atrophy in their gastroc muscle, which represents that they've had a compromised tibial nerve or sciatic nerve for a very long time, because that muscle's no longer getting the blood supply and the information that it needs to. And over time, that will lead to a decrease in an atrophy of the muscle. So that might be an example of how you test the motor component of that particular nerve. Now, there will also be a sensory component. And if you want to be thorough, you have to test both the motor and the sensory parts of the nerve to know how it's actually functioning. So there's a portion of skin down around, basically it's going to traverse across the calf region, and then also down to the heel. So like the back of the heel, and then also across the bottom surface of the foot, kind of like the plantar fascia area, if you will. So you then have to do sensory tests on that portion of the skin, testing things like light touch, vibration. We've got several of them. We've talked about them in past episodes, sharp sensations, warm, cool, things like that. And you're trying to understand, again, like what's the health of this nerve? Like how well is this person sensing these things? And you might find a deficit. So somebody who's had sciatica for a long period of time, maybe they have some atrophy in one of their calf muscles. And then to go with that, you are testing some vibration on the bottom of their foot, and then you compare it to the other side, and they're like, oh, I definitely don't feel that as strongly on that side. And so what you're finding in this example is, okay, we have both motor and sensory deficits related to the tibial branch of the sciatic nerve. Okay. So that's kind of testing. And going back to what you were kind of asking about is, is there like other ways to look at this in terms of, viewing how we might approach this through a neuro lens? And one of the most interesting things that we actually do with nerve glides is we consider it a sensory input. And we have this little mantra: all sensory input goes to the contralateral cortex except smell. So technically, let's say I was to teach you a nerve tensioning exercise for your left tibial nerve, because you've had sciatica for a lot of years and we got to do some stuff to mobilize that nerve. Technically, even though there are local, like mechanical factors going on, being stimulated when you move that left limb, there's also sensory ones based on like what you're feeling from that input. And we can look at that as a cortical activation for the opposite side of the cortex. So basically, if I do a tibial nerve glide on my left leg and I feel that sensation as the nerve gently stretching, moving, nerve glides, when we tension a nerve, generally feel like a radiating stretch down, in this case, the back of the leg. Not an isolated stretch, but like more broad.
Mm-hmm.
Like you might feel this one creep down your hamstring into your calf and then across the bottom of your foot.
Mm-hmm.
That sensation matters for how we're approaching our drilling and working with the brain, because all of that sensation that you're now getting, and if we're adding sensation to the drill, because let's say you don't feel things well around that calf muscle area, I might provide some sort of sensory stimulus to that area while you do a certain neuromechanic drill, because we're trying to restore your ability to feel things better.
Yeah, we're rehabilitating the map. Right?
Yeah, and that's a
clarifying the map.
That's it. We're clarifying that map, and that's a form of stacking, right? We're taking a sensory input, we're combining it with the drill to try to make the stimulus stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have to understand the cortical outcomes of that in order to build our drill and understand what it might do for the person. So we can look at things very locally when it comes to neuromechanic drills, which most people out there who learned a little bit about how to work with nerves, maybe in school or something, they're only looking at it locally. And that's good. You need to do that, right? Because there's a lot of mechanical things that, you need to be thinking about when you're working with a nerve. But what people are not understanding yet, right, based on where we are with just as a whole learning about working with nerves, is that there's some enormous brain-based outcomes. You have to look upstream. You have to understand the higher order systems as well. So it's a really powerful tool when you start to even look at it that way. Because as I was saying earlier, you don't necessarily need to have a nerve problem for a nerve glide to be a useful drill. Not when you understand what the cortical outcomes may be.
Yeah, the temptation is, my shoulder is bothering me. Maybe there's a drill for my shoulder.
Exactly.
And not necessarily to connect it all the way through to the brain.
Right. And I will say, as a local tool, they do work wonderfully that way. Like that's why they get a lot of attention on our Instagram page, is because if you're somebody that doesn't know very much and you're like, hey, my shoulder hurts, and then this guy on Instagram says, if I can't lift a weight out to my side very well without pain, I should try the axillary nerve glide. They do work great that way. It doesn't always work, and there's reasons for that. But as a localized tool that can be kind of quick, like, hey, this one's for the shoulder. If you feel pain there, let's go and try this. It can be really good for that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's dive in. Why don't we talk about some that are near and dear to your heart and get specific?
All right. So we've got, this is kind of, I was doing a little bit of like math before we got onto the podcast here, because I was thinking, I'm like, how many nerve glides do we actually teach? So started kind of counting stuff. So in our courses, we teach 7 main neuromechanic drills for the lower body. Okay. And we teach 8 in the upper body. You could say 9. One of them covers 2 nerves, and it's the same drill for a nerve in the face, actually, trigeminal and facial nerve. So we'll call it 8 upper body nerves. So this is where it gets wild. Out of the 7 lower body peripheral nerves that we can mobilize and the 8 upper body, there are 3 techniques that you can use to address each nerve. So those techniques are, you can either tension a nerve. Okay. That is generally what we call a nerve glide. I'll come back to that and explain it here again in a minute. You can tension a nerve. You can slack a nerve. and you can slide a nerve. And now this is where like the language gets a little bit interesting, because there are other systems out there that use a different language than what I'm using. So this is just so people know, if you have any education in this, that you receive somewhere else, our language might be slightly different. In fact, I have some very angry people that like to reach out to me occasionally to let me know that I'm using the wrong language. But it is what it is. Like, I don't care what it's called.
Yeah.
I just care, what am I doing with it and why?
Yeah.
So we have 3 different possibilities for each nerve, which means that you take 7 lower body drills. You've got 3 techniques that could be applied. You're left with 21 possible drills for the lower body, and you're left with 24 possible drills for the upper body. Now, so we've got a total of 45 neuromechanic drills. Now, here's where it gets wild. Almost every single neuromechanic drill has at least what's called 5 possible drivers. So we call the driver the location of the body that we decide to move once we've either tensioned or slacked, which means shortened the nerve, or I mentioned sliders. I'm going to come back to that one because that's a little bit more complicated to explain. So 5 possible locations, joint locations, where we could mobilize the nerve. So now the number's getting much, much bigger because we've got 45 drills plus 5 possible drivers.
Yeah.
I have every single one memorized. And I'm just proud. I'm proud to say that, because when I first learned these early on, like, one of my instructors was like, you have to take the next year or maybe even 2 to actually learn these and memorize them and feel them in your own body, because there's so many little intricate details to teaching them that you've got to be dialed in. And if you're going to use them effectively, and they are a very effective, fast tool, when somebody comes to you for what we call a drive-by and they say, hey, my shoulder hurts, and you need to pull out axillary nerve glide out of the toolbox, you can't always be referencing your notes every single time you need to teach them. So it's vast in terms of, the number of drills and possibilities that you have. Now, some people might say, like, well, why do you need all those different options? And interestingly, people's responses to the different techniques, the 3 different techniques, tension, slack, or slide, can vary a lot. And people's responses to the drivers that you use can vary a lot. So, for example, going back to that tibial nerve description that I gave, if we're working on somebody's left tibial nerve and we need to choose a driver, maybe we're going to do a nerve glide, we need to choose a location where we're going to mobilize the nerve. So for the tibial nerve, because of where the nerve originates, which is low on the lumbar spine and sacrum, to where it terminates, which is like the toes, you could technically choose to move the toes, the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the pelvis, or the lumbar spine. So you've got a lot of options there, and we choose those different options based on some of our testing. We choose those options sometimes based on health history. Sometimes we choose them based on lack of movement competency from the individual. Because one of the things that you run into that's very challenging for the practitioner is that even though nerve glides, let's say, look very simple, it's actually really hard for the average person to do them, because they have to hold 5 or 6 different pieces of a sequence together to, let's say, put tension on the nerve. And then you have to move one part of the body accurately without losing all those other pieces of the full sequence. So it requires a lot of coordination. And if you don't have that coordination, it's a very frustrating process at first for the coach, because your person doesn't have control over their body because they don't have the basic motor control maps. Hence why we're so adamant about teaching joint mobility.
Yeah.
Because with joint mobility drills, you're learning how to move each one of your joints independently. And when you learn how to move all your joints like that and you gain control of your body, it's easier to do more complicated things and to put all the movement together to do something a bit more sophisticated, like holding a position like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is when, and I think you and Alicia have used this term before, when the appeal of hacks sort of,
Right.
falls to the wayside. It's like,
Right.
oh, all I need to do is this, nerve glide. But to do this nerve glide, I need to have movement literacy to the point where I can do everything correctly in the sequence. And to do that, I need to bring my threat down and my pain down because it's actually impeding me from being able to do all of those things. And to do that, I need to clarify
Yep.
the map, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're knee deep in applied neurology, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well said. So that's why I'm always just telling our students, like, you guys have to put in the time for this joint mobility work so that you know it, so you can teach it to people better, but also so that when you want your clients to perform some of the drill stacks that we create where we're combining things, like you said, they have the literacy to do so.
Yeah.
Now, there's ways to regress the drills too for those folks. There certainly is. In fact, if you're a clinician out there of some kind and you're familiar with some of these nerve drills, there are a lot of options out there. And like if you were to search on YouTube and find different, what they would call like nerve mobilizations for the sciatic nerve or something, they are much more simple than what I'm teaching.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that I'm teaching is very, very precise for very specific reasons, because we're targeting specific branches of, let's say, the sciatic nerve.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to create the right shape of the body in order to put the tension on the nerve right where you want it to be. Then you have to choose the driver that you want, and you're going to choose the driver based on history and assessment and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are ways to regress it, and you'll need to do that for some people sometimes. And hopefully the goal is you can figure out how to do the more complex variation, because they can be really powerful.
What do you say we pick just one specific drill and talk about, the different potential variations, at least
Sure.
some of them, and the why?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as I was saying, we've got our options, our three possible techniques for any peripheral nerve is going to be tension, slide, or slack. So we'll start with tensioning. Tensioning is generally, just so our listeners know my language, tensioning is generally what I call a nerve glide.
Mm-hmm.
Some people just call it a nerve tensioner. Sometimes I might say that, but usually I'm calling it a nerve glide. And that language is slightly different from some of the other things out there. There's actually, it's one of the original systems, I believe, is calls these exercises, similar exercises, neurodynamics. And, that's a whole trademarked thing. And some like medical professionals have had some basic neurodynamics education at some point. So they get, some of these people get mad when I'm teaching neuromechanics, and what I'm calling a nerve glide, they're calling a nerve tensioner, and, it is what it is. It's just language. You run into that wherever you go with all these different things that we do within, health and movement. So let's start with a nerve glide. Let's say we were working with the median nerve. Okay. The median nerve is the nerve that might be in question if you've ever had like carpal tunnel syndrome. So people who type on the computer a lot, do a lot of work with their hands, they might get that discomfort, radiating discomfort in their hand, or like kind of the base, like almost the palm of their hand and into their wrist. Okay.
Yeah.
That might be the nerve in question there. So, through testing, we might figure out that our assessments, our neuro assessments, suggest that a person may benefit from putting tension on the median nerve, which would be the one we're thinking of, and then, mobilizing it in some way. So in order to put tension on the median nerve, what you would do, and I'll walk us kind of through this, and it is what it is. Like, there's a lot of steps, and this is, it's going to be me explaining it, which might not be the easiest for some people, but this isn't too complicated of a position. So if you can imagine, first just straighten your arm and put it down by your side so that your elbow is locked out, and flex your wrist. Extend your wrist. So when you do that and your wrist is extended, it means that your fingers are going to be pointing away from your body rather than toward your body. Okay, we want your fingers
perpendicular to your side.
Exactly. Now from there, your elbow's locked out, your wrist is extended, your fingers are extended, and you're going to now move your hand away from your side. And you only need to move it away, let's call it like a foot, right? It doesn't have to be way out there. Now from here, what you can do is take your whole shoulder and you can draw it down towards the floor without losing the other pieces of the sequence. You're still extending at the wrist. You're still extending at the fingers. Your arm is actually outwardly rotated. Okay. And now your shoulder is depressed. A lot of people at this point are going to say, oh, I'm starting to feel kind of a nervy stretch sensation that creeps across the bottom surface of my fingers into my hand, maybe up the wrist. Maybe some people will kind of report feeling that even in the shoulder region, right? The sensation can kind of travel.
It's almost a little tingly is what
It's almost a little tingly. And if you need to kind of pause and shake that tingliness out, you can, and then you go back into the position. Now, we're not done necessarily, but here's where the most important rule comes into play. With all of these neuromechanic drills, when we're putting tension on a nerve, you want to keep the intensity that you're feeling in terms of that stretch sensation, that tingliness, you want to keep it really gentle. So I always say a 3 out of 10 is what you're aiming for. And I say 3 because most people are going to do a 6, right? They don't want to do it gentle.
More is better, Taylor.
Yeah, right.
You knew that.
Yes, and that's why I always tell people too, this is not a stretch, because a lot of people with a background in stretching, some sort of stretching, have done that very aggressively. Nerves do not want to be aggressively stretched, because remember, we have a nerve and its responsiveness to full range of motion is actually one of its mechanisms is to tell us, please don't go any further. So it's for protective reasons that we have this sensation of neural tension.
So that's a great way to introduce threat, right?
Yeah.
Is let's push it past where it's telling you to stop.
Exactly. So our arms out by our side here, shoulders depressed. And now what you can do is kind of lengthen up through the spine so that you're in good posture. And you can start tilting your head away from the target arm. And when you do this, you will likely feel the neural tension that you feel, the stretching, increase. Because what you're doing is putting additional tension on the nerve. Now, once you're in that position, assuming that you are now maybe at a 3 out of 10, what you can do is raise your shoulder and then drop your shoulder. And so when you raise your shoulder, you elevate it, you'll feel that tension comes off the nerve. When you drop your shoulder back down, you'll now feel that tension returns. This is what we mean when we say mobilize the nerve. Moving the shoulder is what we mean when we say choosing a driver. So this particular driver is, we would call this using the scapula, which is your shoulder blade. Okay. And yeah, you'll feel the tension or the stretch change. And you might do that maybe 6 pulses at the shoulder, 8 pulses, something like that. And then you rest and relax, shake it out. So that is what I mean by putting tension on, in this case, the median nerve, choosing a driver, which was the shoulder blade. And then by moving the shoulder blade up and down, you are mobilizing the nerve. You're sensitizing it. You're taking some tension off it. Then you're adding the tension back in. And there's going to be mechanical outcomes to that. You know, if you do happen to have some kind of, let's say, entrapment, which can happen to nerves. Maybe you have some entrapment in the wrist or the palm, and that's why you have a carpal tunnel type symptoms. By choosing a particular driver, maybe choosing the hand or the wrist to move, That's going to actually move the nerve and require that extensibility that we're after and mobilize it, which could be a really healthy thing for your median nerve. It could also not be the right thing for it. And we can talk about, that here in a few minutes as well.
Yeah. So when you say entrapment, is it like what it sounds like, where it's like the nerve is getting stuck against some sort of tissue or some other part of the body and it's not able to move past that area?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it could be like from an old injury or something. There could be some sort of restrictions in the connective tissues that are holding that nerve back from moving the way that we would want it to. It could be that the nerve has just had poor blood supply for a long time, and it's not moving well. We're not our tissue surfaces are not gliding as well. That kind of a thing. Yeah, so there's several different reasons why we might have entrapment, and that's usually, again, what I was saying is most of the time these types of exercises are more targeted at what might be suggested as an actual entrapment problem. Okay, so that's tensioning, and that's what I call a nerve glide, because once you add the driver motion, it's kind of like gliding the nerve, right? You're adding tension, you're taking it away when you mobilize it. So slacking is different. Okay, a slacking procedure is the opposite of tensioning the nerve. So in this case, using the median nerve as an example, if we wanted to slack that nerve, we'd want to create a shape with our body that brought the nerve into its shortest position. We just put it into its longest position. Now we want to put it into its shortest position. Why might we like to do that? Well, again, good example, carpal tunnel type syndromes or symptoms, excuse me. We may have to consider the fact that the nerve itself is under too much tension already, and it's irritated. So now, instead of overstretching an already irritated and overstretched nerve, which might increase threat and cause problems, we can take that nerve and we can slack it to take pressure and tension off of it. So in terms of the movement, we would do exactly the same sequence, but in reverse. This is why when you memorize all your nerve glides, I always teach people to memorize the tensioning first, because then when they have to learn the slacking procedures, all they do is reverse it. So it's kind of cool that way. So let's go back to that position that we had for the median nerve, where you're extended at the wrist and fingers, they're pointed out to the side, your arm is out to the side, your shoulder is dropped down, your head is tilted away. So now what we do is go joint by joint and we reverse the sequence. So starting at the fingertips, we're now going to curl them. Okay. Then at the wrist, we're now going to curl our wrists. So now our knuckles are pointed back towards our body. From here, we're going to bend our elbow. So now our hand is up by our shoulder, and we've got this flexion of the fingers and the wrist. And now, instead of moving the arm away from the body like we did, we're now going to move it across our body. Okay. And then from here, because we depressed the shoulder to put tension on the nerve, now we want to elevate it. And because we tilted our head away from the target arm to tension the nerve, now we want to tilt our head and neck toward, in this case, the elevated shoulder. So we're left with this funny position where you've got this like club hand, right? It's curled and it's flexed and it's across your midline, and you've got your shoulder elevated and you're basically touching your ear towards your shoulder. And
it's almost like you're trying to give a hug to like a tiny little animal or something.
That's a great way. I'm going to use that, Tony. That's a great way to describe this. You got a little stuffed animal in your arm there, and you're giving it a hug, and you're resting your head on the little stuffed animal's head. Perfect. And what that does is it takes tension off the nerve. So you've shortened that median nerve, okay, rather than elongated it and put it under tension. So once we get into a slack position, we might hold that position kind of like an isometric, And I usually instruct people to do some like really relaxed nasal breathing while they're in the position. Oftentimes we're going to hold that position for time. I don't know, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. You're kind of retesting as you go to see what's helpful, what's not. And so that's an example of a slacking procedure. That is usually the tool we reach for when people are complaining of nerve type symptoms. Lots of radiating, numbness, tingly sensations. Somebody says it feels like it's on fire, or it feels like it's electric. It feels very irritated. And if I move further into a position, it feels like something bad's going to happen. That's usually those indications that the nerve is already under too much tension. So that's slacking. And that's a good tool.
Since I've been going through this as you describe it, and I do encourage the listeners who aren't driving or otherwise compromised to do these drills as we're doing them. It definitely felt like I have some carpal tunnel-y symptoms sometimes, and it definitely felt like the extension, the tension was a little more threatening. Like the tingliness didn't really feel warm and comfortable.
Right.
And slacking definitely felt very comfortable.
Cool.
In the moment. So I don't know if that's a clue that that's good for me.
Yes.
But
it could be
it
a
definitely
clue.
felt good. So
yeah, and that's kind of a typical situation when you're a coach and you're going through some of these drills with people. You are comparing, right? You're kind of comparing like, hey, how does this one make you feel and move? Tensioning versus slacking, and you're making choices based on that. One of the interesting things to understand, if you're a practitioner and you're already somewhat versed in these types of exercises, or you're just learning them, is that taking tension off of a nerve is not always what we're aiming to do. So like the clinical world that is using some exercises like this has a tendency to always feel like the goal is to do the least threatening variations of neuromechanics. And the least, just so people know, out of these three techniques, the least threatening generally are slacking and sliding. Okay. And I'll talk about sliding in a moment. And so the tendency is, okay, so you have pain or you have whatever, let's do these, gentle nerve mobilizations and see if they help. And if they do, great, this is what you'll do. And then eventually when you don't need them anymore, we're done. You can't stop there. And here's why. Nerves are designed to be able to handle tension and load. And if all you ever do is gentle rehab where you're taking tension off of a nerve and, gliding it and sliding it and slacking it, as soon as you go to try to do things with your body that are more aggressive, that put tension back on the nerve, you are still not going to have the tolerance to handle it. So eventually, we talk about different stages of rehab. We have threat reduction and we have threat inoculation. Eventually, when you're healthy enough for some form of threat inoculation, you have to start approaching the nerve tensioning type drills with a bit more intensity so that when you want to be an athlete again and use your body more athletically, your brain doesn't get freaked out by putting tension back on the nerve. And that would put you back to where you started with now, okay, I got to do my slacking, my sliding. So part of every rehab long-term may be to start with the less aggressive, less threatening variations, and then eventually build up to, again, being able to put tension on that nerve. If you think about it this way, let's say I have a history of a tibial nerve problem in my lower body, and I'm the person that had like the sciatica. If I'm a martial artist and I want to eventually be able to kick again with my leg, then I can start with all of these slacking procedures and sliding procedures to take tension off an already irritated nerve. But as soon as I go back to my martial arts practice and start kicking again, that's going to put tension on the tibial nerve because I'm going to be at full range of motion. And, that may be problematic. So eventually I've got to reintroduce some of that ability to tolerate the tension. So,
that makes perfect sense.
Okay. So circling back slightly now, we're talking about sliding. It's a little bit different. Sliding's interesting. It really requires some coordination too. So thinking about this median nerve that we just did, we first put tension on it. So remember that position. Then we did the slacking. Now, if we go back to the tensioning position where hand is extended, fingers are extended, shoulders down, arms out, head is away. Now, I always start people in this position to kind of teach them what sliding may be. Because what we're going to do here is we're going to go to both ends of the nerve. So in this case, the head and neck and the hand. And we're going to move them in opposition of one another. So what that might look like is, if you're in the tensioning position right now for median nerve, now take your head and tilt it toward your shoulder. And what you've effectively just done there is you took some tension off of the median nerve up at the cervical spine, right? In kind of the shoulder area. Okay. But our hand, okay, is still in extension. So there's still a fair amount of tension on the median nerve at the point furthest away from my head. So now what we're going to do is switch my head to tilting it the other way and switch my hand and wrist to now flexing. Now we've applied more tension on the median nerve up by the cervical spine and shoulder, and we've taken tension away down by the hand and wrist. And so if you understand this coordination of kind of like moving in opposition, you would make it dynamic where you're moving back and forth, essentially sliding the nerve. Okay. Some people call them flossing. That's kind of a nice visual too. And that is generally a low threat version of mobilizing the nerve. We take tension off at one end while we apply tension to the other end, and then we switch. That can be highly effective as well, and a good choice when people are having like a lot of symptoms that they're complaining of that may be nervy.
Yeah, so basically you're never at maximal tension and you're changing which direction the tension is strongest.
Exactly. And you can kind of visualize this as like a sliding mobilization of the nerve or a flossing.
Yeah, that's a good image, like a string and just pulling harder on one side and then pulling harder on the other side.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So actually, you want to know what I wanted to cover is why nerve glides sometimes don't work. Like why they're not the best choice. So we kind of have to briefly cover some really brief anatomy of a nerve. So all nerves have a blood supply. Okay, so and all nerves have nerves of their own. Okay, so you can kind of visualize a nerve, like zoom in on a nerve in your mind, and it's basically this like bundle, right? Think about a hose, and then inside the hose is a bunch of other little, smaller hoses, right? That's what I mean by bundle. Okay, and each nerve has its own blood supply, and each nerve has its own nerves. Now, the neural innervation of the nerve trunk, okay, is called a neuri novorum. This you don't have to memorize any of this if you're keeping up and stuff. Don't worry about it. It goes into the weeds a little bit, but I just want to provide some terminology for those people who are ready for it or want to go look it up. So the neural innervation of the connective tissue that is encapsulating the nerve is called the nervi novorum. Okay. Now, this is really interesting structure when you start to look at these peripheral nerves, because these nerve fibers are what we call unmyelinated free nerve endings. Okay. And what that means is that those nerve endings can be either A delta or C fibers. So I know this is all words to some people who haven't heard any explanation yet about actual receptors. But those of you who are deep enough into neuro to know receptors, we're talking about A delta and C fibers, which have different roles. Now, the interesting thing about this type of unmyelinated free nerve ending is that it can take on the function of both a mechanoreceptor or a nociceptor. So that means it can measure mechanical information that's happening during movement, okay? Or nociception, which is essentially threat. And it will decide, how it's going to do that based on what's happening at the level of the tissue. Okay, so this is the nervi nivorum that is responsible for this. This is the innervation of the nerve itself. So we know that these nerve fibers can produce mechanical information about movement. We know that they can become sensitized and produce threat-based information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, circling back to our median nerve and the person who has carpal tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you have carpal tunnel and you see my Instagram video and you're like, oh, this guy says I should do maybe a median nerve glide because I have this carpal tunnel type, sensation in my hand and wrist. Let me give it a try. And you do the nerve glide and it puts tension on the nerve. And that nerve has already been tensioned, right? It's already under a lot of stress. Well, because of those fibers, those unmyelinated free nerve endings we talked about that can either choose to give mechanical information or threat information, if the nerve does not want to be under any more tension, it's likely we're going to get an increase in nociception when we put the nerve under tension. Now, when we do that, threat is going to go up, and it might be perceived by the brain as too much threat, too much tension, and therefore the drill itself assesses poorly.
Yeah.
So a lot of the response comes down to this actual anatomy. Now, if we don't have that problem, maybe carpal tunnel for us was a thing of the past. We've kind of worked through it. We've done some stuff. And that nerve needs some mobilization. We move it properly with a nerve glide. And we get good proprioceptive activity coming from those nerve fibers. Our brain might go, this is exactly what I wanted. This is great. I'm going to grant you more blood supply, more movement, more motor control, and maybe better sensory awareness if we're thinking about the skin distribution that the nerve supplies. Mm-hmm. So it's really cool to know that because it helps you understand why tensioning a nerve might not be the right idea, and therefore maybe we got to slack or slide. But then eventually we got to work towards those tensioning drills to make sure that we can handle that in the long run.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And in fact, earlier on, not long ago, I was teaching our free master class, and I taught a median nerve glide, and one lady ended up messaging and saying something to the effect of like, that really made me a lot worse. So like there was like 30% of people on the call, I would guess, got worse from tensioning the median nerve.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be one of those reasons. But then this woman also said that she had a known vestibular problem. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that can happen to somebody that has a more sensitive vestibular system is once you tension a peripheral nerve and then you have them tilt their head, their brain goes, no way. I don't want tension on a nerve. And now you're tilting the head and we don't have the vestibular competency to understand what's going on. That is, the making for a really lousy drill outcome. And so there's always a reason. Yeah. There's always a reason. And so then, and I always tell our students, like, that's going to happen to you with a client at some point. You're going to do exactly what you think is a home run, and the person's going to get worse. Yeah. And it's good information. It actually helps you just as much as, when things go correctly the way you want them to.
Yeah, I think of your practice as sort of being a detective, right?
Right.
It's all clues. You're not attached to which outcome is the right one. You're trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. It's true. You got to be a detective. I've got a quick story that I think will be cool to tell. And this is kind of a neat one because it involves a buddy of mine who is he's a fishing buddy. And I sort of feel like I have these two different lives. Like mm-hmm. I've got like the stuff I'm doing with health and fitness, and I have friends that, I have friends in a small circle that I might talk to about those things. Then I've got this like fly fishing life. And I've got a larger group of friends over there than I do with health and fitness, oddly enough. And this particular person's one of my buddies in my fishing circle. And this was years ago, before we had an online business. Alicia and I were doing all one-on-one work with people in person. And my friend Frank calls me, and he is just out of sorts. He is literally crying on the phone, telling me this story that happened to him because he got a neck injury. And if you were to see Frank, you'd know something was wrong, because Frank is like the most jacked human being I've ever seen in my life. Like, if you want to talk about the best genetics you've ever seen in your life, this guy walks around at like 8% body fat, completely chiseled. He's like a bodybuilder. And, he's in the military and stuff. He's covered in tattoos. This guy calls me crying, and I'm like, wow, this is a side of Frank I've never experienced before. And he's like, man, I'm sorry for, to bring this, to burden you with this, but I got to tell you what's going on and see what you think. And he went on to tell me the story that he injured his neck, and that likely some of that happened because so many years of, whatever he's been doing in heavy weightlifting and not enough mobility training, and however you want to, frame it, he got a disc injury in his cervical spine, and it was bad. I mean, he couldn't move. He was on the couch for 2 weeks. He couldn't move his head. I mean, we're talking, he couldn't move his head 2 degrees to the right or the left, like no movement. He's out of commission. And of course, he's very scared. Yeah. And he saw several doctors. And one of the doctors that he went to, who was supposed to be like the man, like this is like supposed to be like the guy, was like, this is very serious. We need to put you on a list for emergency surgery. And went through this whole thing about, how they're going to cut him open and do this and do that. And he needs a spinal fusion, or, he risks these horrible injuries, whatever. And Frank was like, that's very hard information to hear. And when you can't move and you're on the couch, you feel helpless. You don't know what to do. You don't know if this person really understands. You don't know if they really are supposed to be the best at this. And their only tool seems to be a scalpel. Nobody wants to hear that. Yeah. So he got a second opinion. The second opinion wasn't as grim, but it wasn't good. So he said, what do you think? And I said, well, I think you can always try something and see how it goes, because what do you have to lose? And he said, okay, I'm game. And so at this point, I had no online presence as a coach. I had no videos. I had no platform, nothing. So I shot him some videos in our house, and I just texted them to him. And he told me what part of his neck hurt. He told me what symptoms he was getting downstream, because he had a lot of muscle atrophy in his shoulder and pec, some stuff in the hand, some numbness, some tingling in the hand. And through what he told me based on history taking, I guessed, one or two of nerves that might be, in trouble. And I filmed him some nerve glide exercises and some nerve slacking exercises for those particular nerves, and 1 or 2 joint mobilizations for his neck. So like our isolated joint mobilizations. Just kind of told him on the phone, like, hey, I got you these drills. Like, you got to make sure they don't make anything worse. I didn't really have a means of teaching him the assessment process. At that point, I didn't have videos for him. So I was like, make sure none of this makes you worse. Start with the slacking. I want you to do the slacking for like a week. If all goes well, I want you to try nerve glide, the tensioning. And then I want you to immediately follow up with slacking again. And after you do that for a week, I want you to change, to doing maybe just some nerve gliding. And this is all while you're still lifting weights, going to the gym, but you're using the other side of your body. And he was like, okay, I'm game, because I'm not going to stop training, because that would be stupid. So he already knew that was a good idea. Yeah, good. And he did his joint mobility and stuff, everything gentle, and just made sure he stayed out of pain. Within like 3.5 weeks, he's calling me saying he's 99% pain-free. He's like, what do you think I should do? I was like, I think you should go fishing. He's like, you think I could go fishing at this point? And so we're really passionate about this thing called spay fishing, which is essentially using a two-handed fly rod. And they're very big rods. They could be like anywhere from 10 to 14 feet. And it uses your whole body to cast it. So you've got both hands on it. He's like, dude, you think I could do that? And I was like, you probably could. And it'd be really good right now to go and do something that you love to get your mind off this. And usually what you see is that using the mechanics that you have dialed in so much reflexively and keeping your attention out as you do that is an amazing way to integrate results. So he went fishing. He called me from the river. He's like, bro, I'm out of pain and I'm killing it. And I was like, that's what I'm talking about, Frank. And it's just a really cool story for me to think about. And it happened at a unique time period because I wasn't set up to do any of this remotely.
Yeah.
Sent him a few videos. He got to avoid an emergency surgery forever.
Yeah.
And he's good to go. And that's the power of neuromechanics.
And so when, you kind of zeroed in on, I think maybe these nerves are in trouble. Like these are the places that need some help. And you're doing slacking and then you're doing tensioning. Is it as simple as, I guess the question is like, was there an acute injury or...
Yeah, he had actual imaging that showed like disc herniation and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was, he definitely had like he had that acute phase that made it very difficult to find entry points because that can be hard. And so he had to do stuff that was really gentle.
And so what happened with the actual herniated disc? Does that...
Well, so you can read different stuff about it. I mean, some people say eventually the disc kind of just dissolves, that the body can deal with it. It may never look the same again on imaging, maybe, is, sometimes what other people are saying. Movement can be restored. Sometimes people feel like they have levels of just kind of low-grade sensitivity that they feel from time to time if they've had a significant enough disc injury. But the point is, and it's important for people to know if they've had a disc injury, is that the body can reabsorb a lot of that, and you can restore function with the right movement.
Yeah, and so these nerve glides, what they did was after the injury, tell the brain, hey, I can move these nerves, I can use these nerves, I don't have to cause pain or immobility.
Right.
It basically desensitized those nerve pathways.
Yes, and took pressure off of the impacted nerve root, because a lot of times the disc, when you have that kind of an injury, will place pressure on the nerve root, and that's what makes it so painful.
Yeah.
That's also what disrupts the function of the nerve and the blood supply to muscles and the skin. So some of those slacking, sliding type drills are a good, gentle approach that are usually your best approach in more of that acute phase. And then as things start to progress, you're starting to move into more of the tensioning again, so that you can restore the tolerance to handle tension on the nerve.
So that would be similar almost to an entrapment, right? Where it's like this disc is pressing on the nerve itself.
Yes.
And so if we can move it away from that and get past that entrapment.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a cool one. Yeah.
So where's the best place for people to find all of those great nerve glides that you have? I know you have videos.
Yeah, so lots of free content that go into a lot of these different variations. So you can find a ton of it on Instagram. Got a lot of nerve glides on Instagram. Starting to film some nerve slacking drills on Instagram too.
Cool.
But these are very intricate drills. They require a lot of precision. If you want to learn how to use this stuff on your body more effectively, then you definitely want to check out the YouTube channel. Just because, and I don't have YouTube tutorials at this point on all of them, but I am starting to chip away. And it's just a better platform to use for trying to learn how to do this stuff correctly, because it's longer form content. Yeah. And then if you want to go deeper and you're a health and movement professional and you want to learn how to use this stuff and add it to your skill set and learn basically everything I covered today and way more. We teach the neuromechanic category of drills in both of our neuro courses. So you'll find it in our neuro foundations and you'll find it in our neuro dojo. And this is actually a great time to talk about that because we're right in the middle of an enrollment process.
That's right.
Yeah. So right now we are taking on students for both courses, as a matter of fact. So both our foundations and our neuro dojo. So the foundations course is coming up very quickly. It starts in March. And the neuro dojo, which is more of our advanced course, we are going to be running in the fall. And right now we actually have a great deal going during the enrollment where you can sign up for both courses with some really big savings. So what you should know about that, actually, I wanted to mention this, is one of the most common things that we've heard is that people are really excited to potentially wait for the neuro dojo and not necessarily do the foundations. And what I want to remind people is if you have a means of doing both courses, you definitely want to do both courses. I don't want anybody to feel like the foundations is beginner and not worth it. What we've actually done is stripped away some of the content from the neuro dojo, put it into the foundations, because the fact is when people get to the neuro dojo, their head spins because it's so much information coming at you.
Yeah.
So we try to balance things out a little bit better. And we're teaching all of the essentials in our foundations course that you have to master in order to go into the neuro dojo and have a lot of success with it. So the goal is to have it be like the bridge. So make sure that if you have the means of doing both courses, that you should do that. And if for some reason you have like a budget concern or something, then you can just sign up for the foundations and you can wait on the neuro dojo. That's still an option. But don't skip out on the foundations because you think you just want to jump into the neuro dojo. Both courses are going to complement each other really, really well. Last about that is if you want to receive information on this enrollment and you want to take advantage of the huge savings that we have on what we're calling the neuro bundle, which is both courses bundled together at an amazing price, you have to be on our email list to be getting that information. And you have to have gone to our free neuro masterclass that I taught in order to get or unlock the savings. So if you haven't done that yet, you can sign up for the free neuro masterclass, and you can find the link in the show notes, or if you follow us on Instagram, you can hit the link in our bio and it will lead you to a place to do that. Whether or not you have time to watch the masterclass or not, as long as you do that and get on our mailing list that way, we will be sending you the discount. Okay, so that's a great way to get that discount for the bundle. So yeah, make sure you're on our email.
Yeah, if you're going to do it, it's a no-brainer.
Yep.
Yeah.
Make sure you're on our email list because that's how we do all of our advertising, and that's how you save money.
Awesome.
All right. So there it is. Quite a bit of information actually on neuromechanics. And I'm happy that we hit that because when you see this stuff on Instagram, it may just look like a stretch, but there's so much more to it. So I was happy to get to talk about that on this episode, and maybe we'll circle back to this again in the future. And because believe it or not, there's even more to uncover and talk about with neuromechanic drills.
Yeah.
So.
For sure.
All right, so that's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back soon.